All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski. I am here with Jackson Slavny, who did a research fellowship with the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. Jackson is a rising senior at Boston College. His major is political science, and he also has minors in Hispanic studies and in chemistry. And Jackson has just wrapped up a really interesting research project titled Language, Law, and Belonging Spans Sephardic Return, Spain's Sephardic Return, rather. So, Jackson, let's get started with talking about this project. Well, why don't you just explain what this title is about, Language, Law, and Belonging, Spain's Sephardic Return, and what sort of got you interested in this project?
Sure. So the first word from that title, language, is probably where this project started. My Bubby would tell me a story about when she was in Jerusalem with a longtime friend who spoke Ladino, and they were at dinner and heard someone in the background speaking Ladino, and it sparked an hours-long conversation between them, and it made me really interested in following up on Ladino. Unfortunately, I'm not a linguist and didn't have much to contribute in terms of purely language study, but I found a way that Ladino was connected to a piece of legislation. Obviously, with my political science background, I thought that government and law might be a bit more appropriate. And I also was planning on studying abroad in Spain. I'm a big fan of Spanish culture and language. And so it felt like this project just kind of connected to all my diverse interests really well. And I had a nice kicking off point.
Great, great. And so this project then is about this law called Law 12. How do we say this? Law 12/2015. And
Yeah.
that's sort of how it officially appears.
Mhm.
So what was this law, and why was it something that was initially passed? Like, what motivates this law?
So Law 12 2015, I refer to it through the project as maybe it's a Sephardic nationality law, as Law 12 2015. It's kind of alternative. But it was a law that sort of carved out special provisions for Spain's Sephardic population to obtain Spanish nationality. So since really a royal decree in 1924, there have been measures to bring the Sephardic Jews back to Spain. But they always had special caveats where you either had to have extended residency in Spain or you had to sort of renounce your prior nationality. And Law 12 2015, which was passed in June of 2015, was a measure to sort of get rid of those hurdles and sort of formally welcome back the Spanish Sephardim. Um, I guess it really began in earnest in 2004. There was it began to have an increased number of applications from Spanish Sephardim or Sephardim of Spanish origin who wanted Spanish nationality as sort of a safe harbor against what they perceived as rising insecurity. These populations often came from Turkey or from Venezuela, and it began to sort of oversaturate the exceptional nature of how Spain was granting Spanish nationality to the Sephardim. So in 2011, Alberto Ruiz Gallardón, who became Minister of Justice and began actively pursuing this policy. There's also arguments to be made that beyond an argument of oversaturation, there was also a bit of a nation branding effort from the Spanish government and an economic argument. Spain was emerging from an economic crisis. It maybe made sense to introduce new Spaniards, especially new Spaniards who they perceived to bring capital to the Spanish economy, to be
Mhm.
integrating them with the Spanish government and the Spanish people once again.
Right. And just to circle back to some of this, so we're really talking about Spain trying to deal with this legacy of the expulsion of Jews in 1491, the Sfardim, which is this word for, Spanish, Jews of Spanish or Iberian
Right.
Peninsula origin. And just and then you name some of the places where they were applying from. So can you just give us a little bit of a backstory on kind of this diaspora of Jews from Spain? Where did they go, and how much did they retain their identity as being from the Iberian Peninsula?
Sure. So as you mentioned, at the end of the 15th century with the Alhambra decree, the Spanish Jews were removed from the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, and they began to spread throughout the Mediterranean basin. Some of them went to North Africa, to Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria. Many went to the Balkans and to Greece. and to
Mhm.
Turkey. And then I guess throughout the years they spread across the world. By the time this law came into effect, there were applications coming from Latin America, many from Northern Latin America. There's also a massive Jewish community in Argentina, composed largely of Sephardim,
Mhm.
Jews in Israel and in the United States. And they applied from across the world. They maintained their culture throughout the years, um, perhaps principally through the preservation of the Ladino language,
Mhm.
which would be essentially the language of Spain at the time of the Jewish expulsion, where the Jews wanted to preserve their culture. It wasn't so much that they wanted to preserve their Spanishness, but that was their language. And
Mhm.
only with the expulsion does Ladino really become a Jewish language. Before that, it was mutually intelligible with Spain Spanish, with
Mhm.
Castilian. And only throughout the years did it become to be a unique language and to maintain its own evolution. Um,
Right.
there's a talk about when we talk about Philo-Sephardism or the love of Sephardic people in Spain. They often talk about the preservation of the Spanish language, and whether you want to say that's a preservation of the Spanish language as such as a Spain Spanish or as a preservation of their roots, that didn't matter much to the Philo-Sephardic thinkers.
Mhm.
But it does matter now with the Spanish government. That's a an evidence of a special connection, is that the Jews can speak what's approximately 15th century Spanish.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing. And so this is a real analog to the preservation of Yiddish
Mhm.
language in Central and Eastern European as well. Yeah, that's really fascinating kind of backdrop to all that. So one of the things that you really do helpfully in your study is you walk through some of the reasons why this law on Jewish return was problematic. From my reading, you sometimes you indicate in a way that maybe this law was even doomed from the start to just really not be able to like live up to its expectations or its promises. So can you walk us through some of these issues that the law of return presents here?
Sure. There were, of course, several sort of, I guess, mechanistic issues with the law. The first being the massive amount of responsibility being deferred to Spanish notaries. They were essentially granted the license to look at the documentation presented by potential applicants and to decide if they were Sephardim or not. These notaries have no experience in genealogy.
Hmm.
They're only being given instructions by the Spanish government on what qualifies as a Sephardim based on the requirements set forth by Law 12/2015, and they're told to make decisions. And this led to some credible accusations of corruption, where notaries were being essentially paid to verify people as Sephardim, whether they were or they weren't. It's not my place to say whether those applications were in good faith and they
Hmm.
were paid extra to sort of push them along, or whether they were not Sephardim at all. But the reality is that by deferring responsibility to such a wide net of relatively unqualified people, um, this law was always going to be difficult to carry out well. The law also sets forth some unreasonable or perhaps unfounded grounds for what qualifies as a Sephardim. One thing, for example, as we talked about with language, Ladino and then Haketia, which is really a like a North African version of a Jewish Spanish language, while those are helpful as evidence of a Jewish people's persisting connection to their Iberian roots, those aren't, in my view, really responsible metrics for qualifying someone for citizenship. If I began to study Ladino or Haketia for months, I might be able to pass the required testing to verify myself as a speaker of Aketia. The law puts forth language that suggests it has to be a familial language, but there's really no way to affirm someone's claim to that. And then finally, in terms of technical issues, the law also requires that applicants pass a Spanish language test to a level of A2, which is
Hmm.
not an exceedingly high level of Spanish, but I think that really runs against the entire point of reparation. These Spaniards, these Jewish Spaniards, lost their Spanishness as a consequence of the Spanish state's actions, not of their own fault. And if they can't speak Spanish, that is the responsibility of the state, not their own. and being forced to pass a Spanish language test and then a Spanish culture test feels to me more of an effort to verify their Spanishness rather than their not even their Spanishness, their modern Spanishness rather
Hmm.
than some sort of Spanish heritage. And then finally, I think this law was unclear on who it was addressed to from the
Hmm.
very beginning. You kind of have two camps. You can have it, the law being aimed at the Jews of Spanish origin, or it can be aimed at Spaniards of Jewish heritage. And I think this law, the majority of this law can be said that it addresses Spaniards of Jewish heritage. It's meant to recognize those who are Spanish and also Jewish, not
Right.
to recognize necessarily the victims of the crime that was committed in the 15th century.
Right, right. Yeah. So that you really, you're helpfully citing this kind of different modalities of problems, and they rest in a couple of different areas. Just walk me through briefly um, about how many people get accepted under this law, and is this law still in effect? Can one still apply if one claims this heritage?
Sure. So I'm gonna have to verify the number, but I know that the law is not still in effect.
Hmm.
The Portuguese law also recently out of power. I'm
Hmm.
looking for a figure for you. I don't want to be incorrect, but I know that over 100,000 people were granted citizenship.
Okay, good.
Let me find this for you real quick. I have it in my paper. It's listed at the top. They received over 150,000 applications, and in the end, citizenship has been granted to 70,000 people. So,
Okay, good.
forgive hesitation.
So this didn't really drastically alter, say, the shape of Spanish society by any means.
It did not.
Yeah.
No. And I think that was potentially floated as a fear early on that this might, introduce non-Spanish people into Spanish the citizenship at large.
Hmm.
I don't think that became a serious concern. And of the 70,000, I couldn't give you an exact figure, but I do know based on the research I've looked at that the majority of them are almost certainly not moving to Spain. They're not changing the demographics of the Spanish state by any means.
Right. So these are people who think, and, and the background here is also the fact that Spain is part of the European Union. So maybe this suggests people who find benefit of holding an EU passport for a whole variety of reasons.
That's right. There's some research, interesting research published from Turkey, for example, where I mentioned Turkey earlier being an example, a place where the Jewish population might feel insecure in their homes. And
Hmm.
there's research, a relatively small sample size, but of all the Turks that were interviewed that had applied for Spanish citizenship, only one of them actually felt some sort. They said that they felt some connection to being Spanish, and the
Hmm.
rest had various reasons, whether they wanted world travel or they wanted to be able to live in the EU or to be able to work in the EU. There's many different reasons. And I think you have to accept that if you're the Spanish state offering a relatively open-ended reparation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this also speaks to kind of the globalized dynamics that undergird this law as well. Okay, yeah, that's really useful. Thank you. Um, so moving along here, um, it seems like this law and kind of the history of the law, the way this played out, says a lot about um, how the Spanish government viewed Jews of Spanish origin. So can you elaborate a little bit more on what you think some of the assumptions were regarding the Sephardim? And do you think Jewish views of Spain evolved and changed as a result of this law being passed, or perhaps now in the aftermath of this law no longer being in effect?
Sure. So I think based on the requirements of the law, it's relatively clear that the Spanish government sees the Sephardim as Spaniards first and
Hmm.
Jews second. And I think as the Catholic state has become less central, or the Catholic Church has become less central to the Spanish state, Spain is more open to accepting Spaniards of non-Catholic background. It's not that they're necessarily more open to accepting Jews, is that they're willing to see them as Spanish first rather than Jewish first.
Hmm.
And I don't think this is necessarily like a flawed issue from the Spanish state's perspective. If they're passing legislation to grant Spanish nationality, I can understand why they're acknowledging Spaniards, rather than acknowledging people that are the crime of a transgression centuries ago. Both approaches are fine. It's definitely easier to get it through Parliament if you're looking to recognize Spaniards rather than a 5 century estranged population.
Right.
And then in terms of Jewish views of Spain, obviously I can't speak for all Jewish people, and there's not really any source that can speak for all Jewish people, but I can say that I've encountered dozens of Jewish reports on how they felt slightly let down or perhaps even violated by this law.
Hmm.
That they were promised a return to their ancestral homes and an apology for what had happened. But if you look at the language of Law 12, 2015, the preamble says nothing about acknowledging a wrong on behalf of the Spanish state. It acknowledges a
Hmm.
historical
Hmm.
wrong through the forces of history as an abstract, but it doesn't accept responsibility for what happened. It's perhaps not their place to accept responsibility, but I do know that to a Jewish audience, they might interpret this as sort of maybe a false apology or begin to suspect some underlying motivations for why this law might be passed. I'm sure the Jews that were granted Spanish citizenship, many of them will look at this positively. I know there's many reports as well that say that this is a great effort in theory from the Spanish government, that they're happy that people are taking steps towards addressing historical wrongs. Perhaps it didn't get carried out exactly as they hoped, but many will acknowledge that maybe this came from a place of sincerity and that they're happy that historical wrongs are beginning to be talked about and addressed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You framed this earlier on as an act of reparation, but it's a very limited kind of reparation. It's saying we will grant you citizenship um, after clearing all these various bureaucratic hurdles. But there's no financial compensation. There's no extra benefits that accrue to returning Sephardim, as far as I can tell. So the it's a very delimited notion of reparations at play here.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so a final question that seemed to be kicking about that I think you sort of hint at overall in your research is that this law is a sort of cautionary tale about the limits of legislation to address historic injustice. So, what lessons have you drawn from your analysis of Law 12, 2015? And based on those lessons, do you think there's any insights that, future legislators might want to consider, even not even just around, say, questions of reparations towards Jews, but these kinds of larger questions about how does a nation state address historical inequities?
Right. So I want to, I guess I should be clear that I don't think that legislation is unable to address these issues, or not at least to partially address these issues. But it's exceedingly difficult to try to compose an entirely comprehensive act of legislation that's going to address a wrong that occurred 5 centuries ago. Um,
Right.
I think it's important to recognize that the responsibility for moving forward with a reparative issue is on the behalf of those who perpetrated the issue or those who benefited, I suppose, from the perpetration of the issue, and the responsibility or the choice of those who were wronged, whether to accept this or not to accept this. Um,
Hmm.
I think a principal issue with this legislation is that it demanded that those who were wronged to prove themselves to be sufficiently Spanish to receive what was at the same time being portrayed as their historical right, I suppose.
Hmm.
And so to make someone qualify with exceedingly difficult criteria for selection and at the same time frame this as, I guess, in the preamble through some flowing writing about how this is like we're recognizing Spaniards at last, we're welcoming them home. Yeah, the king talking about how much we have missed you, and at the same time demanding they pass a Spanish culture exam. That doesn't seem to line up to me.
Right.
I think you have to connect the reparative effort to the original transgression. So for half of the requirements for this law, it asked those who were applying to find a special connection to Spain. And
Hmm.
I think that finding a special connection to Spain, for example, through the study of Spanish history is the first thing they list, is maybe the wrong way to look at this, and they should instead look for a special connection to maybe to their Sephardic roots. If you're going to look at the crime that was committed was committed against Sephardim, and not against Spaniards. They removed them. They wouldn't remove what they acknowledged as genuine Spaniards. So I think in return, the Spanish government should have, and I guess all future legislators that look to the same goal, you should look to connect the legislative effort to the crime that was originally committed, not necessarily to your state as it is now. And
Right.
then I think finally, um, legislators use ambiguity in the law pretty frequently to try to leave space for things that they didn't anticipate. But I think when you're working with an issue as sensitive as a reparation of this type, you can't leave any ambiguity at all. There's a clause in both the special connection to Spain and in the proving Sephardic identity that said that any other appropriate measure can be used as proof to verify one's application. And I think, well, this was probably well intentioned as a catch-all for things that they didn't anticipate because it's extremely difficult to verify 5 centuries of lineage. This also left room for people to be rejected in a way that they didn't understand and to potentially be even more bitter against the Spanish state than when they started. After 5 centuries, perhaps the crime had, I'm speaking off the cuff here, but perhaps the crime had begun to fade in intensity, and this just reopened wounds that couldn't be closed.
Yeah, yeah, those are some helpful assessments. And then this raises to mind really this question, were Jews consulted in the drafting of this legislation?
There was consultation with Jews at the presentation ceremony, for example. There were many leaders from the Federation of Jewish Communities in Spain.
Hmm.
But it was passed through Spanish Parliament. It was deliberated in Spanish Parliament. The Spanish Jews aren't. I mean, I'm sure there are Jewish members of the Spanish Parliament, perhaps, or those of Sephardic of heritage, but there's no rabbinical authorities obviously voting in Parliament, nothing like that.
Yeah, right.
So this was designed in conjunction with the proper Spanish authorities and the Jewish communities, but in the end, it was voted on by Spanish policymakers and not Jewish leaders.
Yeah, yeah. So again, it speaks to this kind of disconnect, whether perhaps unintentional, an oversight perhaps, but again, it speaks to the real challenges of drafting legislation to address a community that doesn't have political or cultural power in the state.
Right.
Yeah.
Not to the same degree that those who were principally designing the
Yeah,
legislation.
exactly. Exactly. Good. Well, Jackson, really, thank you so much for doing this research. I was aware of this law, but I really learned a lot from reading it. And I am your presentation and your research, and I really hope that people learn something from this video as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all your help. It was a pleasure.